If you ask me to name a country that most deserves its own video, the answer is Brazil. This vast, vibrant, and varied nation has so much to offer, and its history is so unique that it's hard to believe it all happened for real. So let's get to it. The name Brazil comes from the Brazilian wood industry in the 16th century. Brazil was colonized by Portugal. And before we go any further, I have to tell you about the biggest myth in Brazilian history, namely that there were no indigenous people here before the Portuguese arrived. That is completely false. In fact, there were hundreds of different tribes with millions of people living in what would become Brazil before the Portuguese ever set foot there. However, because the Portuguese only ever interacted with a handful of these tribes, and because they had very little contact with the other hundreds, we're going to do our best to represent all Brazilians by focusing on the two most well-known tribes, the Tupinambas and the Guarani. When the Portuguese began exploring the coast of Brazil in the early 1500s, they encountered the Tupinamba people. The Tupinamba were coastal dwellers who lived in large villages and were expert fishermen. They were also known for their impressive feats of body modification, including a particular style of tattooing. In fact, when the Portuguese started venturing further inland, they encountered another group of people who were so heavily tattooed that they named them the painted people, or the vermelhos, which in Portuguese means red people. These people were actually the Guarani, who were quite different from the Tupinambas. The Guarani were an incredibly large and influential group of people who lived in smaller, more isolated villages and were expert hunters and gatherers. As the Portuguese continued to explore and settle in Brazil, the two groups would become increasingly important in the colonial narrative, both as victims and aggressors. When the Portuguese began to encroach on indigenous lands, both tribes fought back. There were numerous battles between the Portuguese and the indigenous people, but ultimately the Portuguese were victorious. The Guarani were almost completely wiped out within a century after first contact with the Portuguese, while the Tupinamba survived longer, thanks in part to their decision to adapt to the colonial reality by learning Portuguese, converting to Christianity, and adopting some of the Portuguese customs. Many of them even became wealthy landowners and slave owners themselves. However, this did not save them from being gradually killed, enslaved, or assimilated until they eventually disappeared as a distinct group of people. The wealth of the Brazilian colonies came primarily from the export of sugar. This was made possible by the introduction of African slaves, who were captured and sold in Brazil between the 16th and 19th centuries. In fact, during this time, Brazil was the biggest slave market in the world. As many as 5 million slaves were brought here from various parts of Africa, mainly Angola and Mozambique. It's important to note that slavery wasn't officially abolished in Brazil until 1888, making it the last country in the Americas to do so. After gaining independence from Portugal in 18, Brazil became an empire ruled by a king who appointed a prime minister to govern the country in his stead. This system worked relatively well until the mid-19th century, when the ruling elite began to fear the growing influence of European immigrants and the prospect of a worker-led revolution. In 1889, a military coup overthrew the monarchy and established a republic. This was followed by a period of significant political instability and violence, as well as massive economic growth fueled by the discovery of gold in the state of Minas Gerais. In the early 20th century, Brazil experienced a cultural explosion known as the Brazilian Modernist Week. This was a celebration of Brazilian culture and identity that took place in the city of 25 de Março, 1922. The event was organized by a group of intellectuals and artists who wanted to break away from the traditional European artistic influences and celebrate Brazilian culture. This movement had a profound impact on Brazilian art, literature, and music, and it helped to establish Brazil as a major cultural player on the world stage. In the second half of the 20th century, Brazil continued to grow economically and culturally, hosting the FIFA World Cup in 1950 and the Olympic Games in 1960. However, the country also experienced a period of military dictatorship from 1964 to 1985. This regime was marked by widespread human rights abuses and political repression, but it also oversaw significant economic and technological development. After the dictatorship was overthrown, Brazil returned to democracy and embarked on a new era of economic growth and stability. Today, Brazil is one of the largest economies in the world and a major player in international politics. The country continues to face challenges such as income inequality and environmental degradation, but it remains a vibrant democracy and a cultural powerhouse. Thanks for watching.